So if you ask, like, the average person on the street to picture therapy, they almost always conjure up the exact same image.
Oh, yeah, you mean the leather couch.
Right, exactly. You're lying on a leather couch, you're staring at the ceiling, and there's a person with a notepad sitting slightly behind you, completely out of sight.
Just waiting for you to talk about your mother.
Yeah, asking you to talk about your childhood, your deepest, darkest secrets. And it's this process that's supposed to take years, like maybe even decades, just a never-ending archaeological dig into your past.
Right, which is the classic Freudian psychoanalytic stereotype. And I mean, while that model absolutely laid the historical groundwork for, well, everything we know about psychology, for a lot of people today, it feels incredibly misaligned with their actual lives.
Because it's so focused on the rearview mirror.
Exactly. There's this growing, palpable frustration where people are walking out of clinics saying, okay, I understand why I am the way I am. I recognize my childhood trauma, but
But I still have absolutely no idea how to fix my life right now.
yes, what do I do today? And that disconnect is exactly what we're exploring in this deep dive today. We're looking at a massive paradigm shift in the world of counseling and psychotherapy.
Specifically diving into Unit 4, Emerging Trends in Counseling and Psychotherapy.
Right. The foundational ideas are moving away from just endlessly excavating problems and shifting towards some radical new approaches.
Which is just so fascinating. We're talking about taking immediate action. We're talking about actively rewriting the narrative structure of your life.
We're even looking at leaning into digital avatars or, doing the exact opposite and physically stepping out of the clinic and into the dirt.
So our mission today is really to give you, the listener, a practical toolkit from these sources to help you understand this transition from viewing the client as a passive victim of their unconscious mind.
Right, someone who's just at the mercy of hidden instincts.
Yeah, moving from that to viewing the client as an active, empowered architect of their own reality. By the end of this deep dive, you'll have new frameworks for solving your own problems.
So let's jump right into the first major rebellion against that old leather couch model, which is reality therapy.
Right, primarily developed by William Glasser.
Yes. And to really grasp how disruptive Glasser was, we have to establish the baseline he was attacking. The traditional models relied heavily on the idea of determinism.
Meaning you're driven by unconscious instincts, you're pushed and pulled by psychological forces you don't even realize are operating in the background.
Exactly. Glasser completely rejected that deterministic view. He built reality therapy on top of a psychological framework called choice theory.
Choice theory, okay.
The foundational premise here is that humans operate on a conscious level. We are not blindly driven by unconscious, uncontrollable forces. Instead, human behavior is highly purposeful.
So everything we do has a reason.
Right. Every single thing we do is designed to meet our basic human needs in the present moment. Choice theory dictates that almost everything we do is a choice, and because it is a choice, we must assume absolute responsibility for those actions right now.
Wow. I'm trying to visualize this shift in perspective. It feels like the traditional psychoanalytic approach forces you to be like a passenger in a car, constantly staring into the rearview mirror.
That's a great way to put it.
You're intensely analyzing every single bump in the road you just drove over, trying to figure out why the road was paved that way or, who was to blame for the potholes.
Right.
But reality therapy forces you to look through the windshield, grab the steering wheel, and recognize that you are the one deciding where to steer the car next.
That captures the internal locus of control perfectly. I mean, if you are physically holding the steering wheel, you can't logically blame the road behind you for the ditch you're driving into right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Reality therapy operates on the belief that human learning is a lifelong process based entirely on choice. So the therapist's role fundamentally changes. They aren't an archaeologist digging through your past to find a root cause.
They're more like a driving instructor.
Yeah, exactly. Their role is to challenge you, to look at what you are doing at this very second and ask, is this specific behavior actually getting you what you want?
So the mechanics of how this works in a practical setting, according to the text, is this framework called the WDEP system.
Right, formalized by Robert Wobholding.
Let's really break this down because the underlying psychology of each step is incredibly confronting. The W stands for wants.
Wants, needs, and perceptions. The therapist helps the client explore what they actually want out of a situation. And, this is significantly harder than it sounds.
Really? I feel like people always know what they want.
Well, human beings are incredibly adept at articulating what they do not want. If you ask someone about their life, they will tell you they don't want to be stressed, they don't want their partner to nag them, they don't want to be broke.
Oh, right. We just list our complaints.
Exactly. But they've rarely defined the positive target they're aiming for. The brain gets stuck in a threat avoidance loop. The W phase forces the brain to switch from avoidance to approach.
Like, what does the ideal scenario actually look like?
Right. What does it look like in your quality world, which is Glasser's term for the mental picture album we keep of our perfect life?
So if someone comes in complaining about a terrible boss and how much they hate their job, the therapist doesn't spend an hour unpacking why the boss is a narcissist. They ask, what kind of career do you actually want to wake up to?
Yes. You force the client to paint a highly specific, concrete picture of the desired outcome. Only then can you move to the D in the WDEP system, which stands for doing and direction.
Doing and direction. This is where you have to look at the actual mechanics of your daily life, right? Not your intentions, not your hopes, but your physical actions.
This step requires a ruthless level of objectivity. What are you actually doing right now? Where is your current direction taking you?
I can see how that would get uncomfortable fast.
Oh, it does. In clinical practice, clients often try to substitute feelings for actions. They'll say, I'm feeling so anxious about my career.
And the therapist says what?
The reality therapist will redirect and ask, I hear that you feel anxious, but what are you physically doing about your career today? Are you sending resumes? Are you networking? Or are you binge watching television and complaining to your friends?
Wow, just cutting right through it.
The focus is obsessively kept on observable behavior because behavior is the only thing you have direct control over.
That brings a really heavy level of accountability.
Yeah.
If I know what my wants are and I have just clearly listed out what my doing is, well, the natural collision of those two things has to be the E, evaluation.
Evaluation is the crucible of reality therapy. The therapist asks the client to evaluate their own behavior. The classic Wobolding question is what you are doing right now getting you closer to what you want?
Oof, that forces a massive cognitive reality check.
It really does. If you want a promotion that is your want, but your doing involves showing up late, avoiding new projects, and gossiping, the evaluation phase forces you to physically vocalize the disconnect.
But the genius here is that the therapist doesn't judge the behavior, right? The therapist doesn't say, you are being lazy.
No, not at all.
The therapist just holds up the mirror and lets the client judge their own mechanics.
Because if the therapist tells you that you are wrong, your brain immediately gets defensive. You start arguing with the therapist.
Right, you push back. But if the therapist just asks, is yelling at your spouse getting you the loving marriage you said you wanted? You have to argue with yourself.
Precisely. You completely bypass the client's external defense mechanisms. When a client realizes that their chosen behavior is directly sabotaging their stated wants, a state of cognitive dissonance occurs.
It becomes incredibly uncomfortable to maintain the destructive behavior.
Exactly. And that discomfort is the catalyst for the final letter, P, which is planning.
Right, because once that realization hits, you can't just leave the client sitting in the discomfort of their own sabotage. You have to build a bridge out.
And the plan has to be highly structured.
Yeah.
Wobolding used another acronym for this, which is SAMIC3.
SAMIC3, what does that stand for?
The plan must be simple, attainable, measurable, immediate, and controlled by the planner.
Controlled by the planner, meaning you.
Right. You don't make a plan that says, I will be a better partner. That is way too vague. You make a plan that says, when I get home from work today at 5:30 p.m., I will put my phone in a drawer for 30 minutes and ask my partner about their day.
I see. It's immediate, you control it, and you can measure whether or not you did it.
Exactly.
What strikes me about this entire shift, from the past to the present, is how much it rebels against the traditional medical model of psychology.
Oh, absolutely. The medical model inherently treats psychological distress like a disease. You are a patient. You have a sickness.
And that sickness was likely caused by a pathogen, like a bad childhood, a trauma, some unconscious complex.
And the doctor has to diagnose it and cure you. It is a very passive state. Reality therapy rips that victimhood away entirely. It asserts that you are not sick. You're simply choosing a set of behaviors that are not effectively serving your needs.
It's empowering, but it also strips away all of our favorite excuses.
Right.
You can no longer say, well, my parents were emotionally distant, so I guess I am just wired to be terrible at communication.
Right. Reality therapy looks at that and says, okay, your parents were distant. That is an event that happened. But choosing to ignore your partner today is a behavior you are electing to do right now, Let's fix the behavior.
It makes the therapy highly versatile and, I'd imagine, surprisingly short-term. You don't need 5 years of weekly sessions to untangle the historical knot of why you are fighting with your spouse.
No, you need to identify what you want, brutally evaluate what you're doing, and make a new plan today.
But if reality therapy puts you in the driver's seat of the car, there's an entire branch of psychology we read about
Yeah.
that goes a massive step further. It essentially gives you a pen and asks you to completely redraw the map you were driving on.
Yes. We are moving into constructivist approaches.
And this moves us into some deeply profound philosophical territory. Constructivist approaches are rooted in a sociological and psychological concept called social constructionism, right?
Right. And the premise here is kind of mind-bending. It is the belief that there is no single objective reality or absolute truth out there waiting to be discovered by a therapist.
Wait, really? No objective reality at all?
Instead, our reality is actively constructed through human interaction, through dialogue, and fundamentally through language.
Okay, can we ground that in a practical example? Because that sounds really abstract.
Sure, imagine two different people go through the exact same objective event. They both get laid off from their jobs on the same day by the exact same manager.
Okay.
Person A constructs a reality where this event is the ultimate failure. They use language internally that says, I am worthless, I am unhireable, my life is ruined.
Very problem-saturated.
Exactly. Person B, however, constructs a reality where this is a necessary liberation. Their internal language says, I was stagnating anyway, this is the push I needed to start my own business, this is a stepping stone.
Right, so the objective physical event is identical. They both lost their jobs.
But the reality they inhabit, the emotional ecosystem they live inside of, is entirely constructed by the meaning they attach to the event through language.
If that's true, if there is no objective truth about a client's problem, only the reality they've built around it, how does a therapist even begin to treat them?
It completely upends the traditional power dynamic in the clinical room. In a constructivist approach, the therapist adopts what is formally called a not-knowing position.
Non-knowing position.
They refuse to act as the all-knowing medical expert who is there to diagnose a broken gear in the client's brain. Instead, they enter the client's world with intense, genuine curiosity.
The core assumption being that the client is the ultimate, unrivaled expert on their own life.
Exactly. The therapist is merely a co-author, bringing structural tools to help the client write a better draft of their reality.
One of the most famous and pragmatic applications of this philosophy is solution-focused brief therapy, or SFBT.
Yes, pioneered by Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim Berg at the Brief Family Therapy Center in Milwaukee back in the 1980s.
They took this high-level constructivist idea and made it incredibly tactical.
Yeah.
They basically argued that if reality is constructed, we need to stop spending all our time constructing problems and start constructing solutions.
They were radically pragmatic. SFDT is fiercely future-focused and goal-oriented. In fact, it intentionally ignores the history of the problem. DeShazer and Berg operated on three very simple but incredibly deep rules of thumb.
Let's hear them.
Rule number 1. If it isn't broken, don't fix it.
Which sounds like common sense, but in the context of therapy, I mean, it's very easy for a clinician to go looking for trouble, to start digging up childhood memories or pointing out mild dysfunctions that the client wasn't even bothered by.
Exactly. The human mind is complex enough without a professional actively searching for new things to pathologize.
That's their point. What's rule 2?
Rule number 2 is really the engine of the therapy. If it works, do more of it. If you find even a microscopic sliver of behavior that is helping the client, you amplify it, you study it, you replicate it.
And rule 3?
Rule number 3. If it doesn't work, do something else. Stop banging your head against the exact same wall, hoping the bricks will suddenly turn into a door.
I want to dig into the actual techniques they use to enforce these rules, because the psychology behind them is brilliant. The most famous tool in the SFBT arsenal is the miracle question.
Oh, yes. The miracle question.
And for you listening right now, I highly recommend actually trying this mental exercise. The therapist looks at the client and says, and I'm paraphrasing here, imagine that tonight, while you are sleeping, a miracle happens. The specific problem that brought you into this room today is completely solved.
But because you are asleep, you don't know the miracle happened.
Right. So when you wake up tomorrow morning, what will be the very first, smallest observable sign that tells you a miracle has occurred?
Yeah.
What will be different?
From a neurological standpoint, this question is an absolute masterpiece. When human beings are deeply entrenched in a state of distress or trauma, the brain develops profound tunnel vision.
because of the amygdala, right?
Yep. Exactly. The amygdala, our threat detection center, is highly active, and it restricts our cognitive focus entirely to the pain. If you simply ask a distressed person, how do we solve this? They will almost always say, I don't know, because their brain is literally not in a state to access creative problem solving.
The prefrontal cortex is basically being suppressed.
Right. But the miracle question acts as a cognitive bypass. It doesn't ask them to solve the problem. It asks them to vividly imagine the aftermath of the solution. It essentially tricks the brain into accessing a state of relief and creativity.
Because it lowers the stakes. The client doesn't have to figure out how to cure their deep-seated depression.
Yeah.
They just have to imagine what a non-depressed morning looks like.
Yes. The client might say, well, if the miracle happened, the first sign would be that I wouldn't hit the snooze button 4 times. I would actually get up, open the blinds to let the light in, and make a pot of coffee instead of staring at the ceiling.
Boom. The therapist suddenly has a tangible behavioral goal. The first step toward the solution isn't cure depression, it's make coffee.
It constructs a brand new positive reality in the room, and they pair this with scaling questions.
Scaling questions. How do those work?
The therapist will ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is the morning after the miracle and 1 is the worst the problem has ever been, where are you today?
Okay, so if the client answers with a 3, a traditional therapist might ask, why is it so low? What makes it a 3?
But the SFBT therapist asks the exact opposite. What makes it a 3 and not a 2?
Wow. That is such a subtle linguistic flip, but it completely changes the trajectory of the conversation.
It forces the client to immediately identify their own resilience. To answer that question, the client has to say, well, it's a 3 and not a 2 because I did manage to get out of bed today and I did call my sister.
Suddenly, the therapist is collecting evidence of the client's strengths.
Exactly. And this leads directly into exception seeking, actively hunting for the times when the problem wasn't a problem, and analyzing how the client achieved that exception.
I have to push back here for a moment, though, because while this sounds incredibly efficient, it also sounds, well, potentially cold.
How so?
Let's say someone comes into the clinic carrying a massive amount of genuine pain, a profound grief, or severe debilitating anxiety. If I come to you bleeding emotionally, and your first response is to ask me to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, or imagine a miracle where I'm not bleeding, doesn't that run the risk of feeling deeply dismissive?
I see what you mean.
Like putting a superficial Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Huh?
I don't want to talk about the miracle yet. I want you to acknowledge the hole in my chest.
That is the most significant and valid criticism of the early iterations of solution-focused brief therapy. Steve DeShazer was famously uncompromising about his formula. He firmly believed that you didn't need to know a single detail about the nature of a problem in order to build a solution for it.
Which is pretty extreme.
It is, but from a purely humanistic perspective, that ignores a fundamental need. Human beings need to feel witnessed. If a therapist skips straight to the solution mechanics, the client often feels invalidated, and the therapeutic alliance fractures.
So how did the field adapt? Because you can't just abandon the efficiency of SFBT, but you also can't alienate the client like that.
The evolution came through practitioners like William O'Hanlon, who developed a variation he called possibility therapy, or solution-oriented therapy.
Okay, and what did he change?
O'Hanlon recognized the disconnect and added a crucial, non-negotiable first step, which is profound validation. O'Hanlon argued that a therapist must deeply acknowledge, validate, and honor the client's emotional pain and historical context before executing any pivot toward solutions.
So the therapist has to look at the client and basically say, I see that you are bleeding. I see how terrifying and painful that is, and it makes complete sense that you are suffering given what you have been through.
Exactly. You have to establish the empathy baseline. You have to prove you are in the trench with them before you ask them to climb out.
Right. Once the client's nervous system settles because they feel understood and their subjective reality is validated, then you can safely introduce the constructivist tools.
You can start building the bridge out of the pain without making the client feel like their suffering was ignored. It beautifully marries the deep empathy of traditional counseling with the relentless forward momentum of solution-focused work.
That structural empathy brings us perfectly to the other major pillar of constructivist therapy, which is narrative therapy.
Yes, developed by Michael White and David Epstein.
And if SFBT is about constructing solutions, narrative therapy is about recognizing the sheer, terrifying power of the stories we tell ourselves.
The core operating metaphor of narrative therapy is that humans are meaning-making machines. We are constantly bombarded by raw, chaotic, sensory data and random life events. To make sense of it all, our brains weave this data into a coherent narrative.
We tell stories to understand our identity.
Right. But psychological distress occurs when our lives become dominated by what White and Epstein called problem-saturated stories.
These are the heavy, definitive statements we make about ourselves. I am a failure. I am unlovable. I am a deeply anxious person. The problem stops being a behavior and metastasizes into an identity.
And the psychological weight of that fusion is immense. If you believe, I am an anxious person, then anxiety is woven into your DNA. You can't fight it without fighting yourself.
So how do you break that?
The most powerful and transformative technique in narrative therapy is a process called externalizing the problem. The therapist meticulously helps the client separate their core identity from the issue.
The defining mantra of narrative therapy being, the person is not the problem is the problem.
Exactly.
How does that actually play out in a dialogue, though? Because if a client is sitting there saying, I have a terrible temper, I'm a monster, how does the therapist unravel that knot?
The therapist relies heavily on linguistic reframing. They will literally personify the problem. Instead of accepting the statement, I have a terrible temper, the therapist might ask, when does the temper usually try to take over the house?
Oh, wow. Or how does the depression convince you to stay in bed?
Yes. You turn the psychological issue into an external entity, an unwanted guest, a monster, a storm.
The cognitive shift there is massive. Suddenly, the therapist and the client are sitting on the same side of the table, teaming up to strategize against the temper. You are no longer fighting your own mind. You are plotting a defense strategy against an external invader.
This relies on a mechanism called cognitive diffusion. By externalizing the problem, you completely remove the shame. Shame is highly paralyzing because it attacks the self. Once the shame is removed, the client's brain can actually look objectively at the mechanics of the problem.
Once the problem is externalized, the therapist moves to the next phase, which is reauthoring.
Right. The therapist acts like an investigative journalist, hunting for unique outcomes. These are the moments, even if they are rare, when the client successfully defeated the monster.
Like, tell me about a time last week when the temper tried to take over, but you managed to keep it out of the room.
Precisely. And when the client identifies that victory, the therapist uses it to begin writing a brand new, empowering narrative. White and Epstein were incredibly creative in how they solidified these new stories.
I read about this in the source material. It's so cool. They recognized that a new narrative is fragile, right?
Yes. So they would literally write detailed letters to the clients between sessions, summarizing the client's victories against the problem and reinforcing the new identity.
They would even share letters from former clients who had defeated similar problems. They were building an audience and a supportive community to anchor this new reality.
It's a really beautiful process.
And this concept that our identities are essentially stories we can rewrite is so deeply embedded in how the modern human brain works. And it leads to one of the most fascinating applications highlighted in the research. There's a specific 2014 study by Graham detailing the use of narrative therapy for video game addiction.
Oh, that study is a masterclass in meeting a client exactly where they are within their own constructed reality.
Think about the traditional approach to video game addiction. A therapist would likely view the gaming as a pure pathology, a destructive habit that needs to be eliminated.
Right. Stop playing the game.
But Graham realized that video games are fundamentally story-based. Gamers are already spending hours every day participating in epic narratives. They're overcoming immense obstacles, learning complex systems, leveling up, managing resources, and defeating monsters.
So instead of pathologizing the game, the narrative therapist utilizes that exact same story structure. They map the clinical intervention directly onto the client's existing psychological framework.
Exactly. The therapist sits down with the gamer and helps them identify the incredible cognitive skills they are demonstrating online. Strategic planning, extreme resilience after failing a level, teamwork and leadership in multiplayer guilds.
Complex problem solving.
Right. The therapist then helps the client rewrite their narrative to transfer those exact same skills to their offline life. The therapist essentially says, you are a high-level strategist and a resilient leader in the game. How do we deploy those stats against the obstacles in your physical life?
You're helping them realize they are the main character in the real world, equipped with a massive inventory of skills.
It perfectly illustrates the core constructivist ideal. The gamer identity isn't inherently the problem. The problem is simply the arena they are choosing to apply it to. By shifting the narrative context, you literally change the client's reality.
And this incredible crossover of narrative structuring and digital environments brings us directly to the next frontier in psychology.
Right, we've been talking about rewriting reality using language. Now, we have to talk about what happens when the therapy room itself becomes a literal digital construct. This is the realm of telecounseling, virtual reality, and AI in psychotherapy.
This is the bleeding edge of the field. We are witnessing a complete rapid evolution of the delivery systems for mental health care.
For a long time, computer-assisted therapy just meant doing a standard session over an internet phone line or, video conferencing platforms. Or perhaps engaging in real-time chat rooms and email exchanges for support.
And we obviously saw that infrastructure skyrocket out of sheer necessity in recent years.
But the current research is pointing to something much deeper and more structurally profound than just video calling your therapist. We're talking about immersive virtual reality and artificial intelligence.
Virtual reality exposure therapy is rapidly becoming one of the most established and effective tools on this frontier. Let's look at something specific, like a severe phobia of flying.
Okay, flight phobia.
Traditionally, exposure therapy required the client to simply close their eyes and visualize a plane, which relies heavily on their imagination. Or the therapist had to physically take the client to a busy airport, which is logistically difficult and highly unpredictable.
But with VR, the therapist has absolute granular control over the environment.
Exactly. The therapist puts a headset on the client and drops them into a perfectly simulated, high-fidelity airplane cabin. The clinician can control the exact volume of the engine noise. They can induce specific levels of turbulence.
Wow.
They can manipulate the exact sensory stimuli that trigger the client's panic, all while keeping the client in a perfectly safe, controlled physical environment. It allows for perfect habituation.
The amygdala learns that the stimuli are not actually life-threatening.
Right. It is the ultimate constructed reality, engineered specifically for a therapeutic purpose.
That makes perfect sense for exposure therapy. But here is the element that feels deeply sci-fi, and where the philosophical implications get really heavy. The research details computer simulations where sophisticated programs or avatars are developed to respond directly to a client's written or verbal statements.
Virtual therapists.
Yes, the client is experiencing a virtual therapist whose responses are pre-programmed by actual clinicians or increasingly driven by large language models. But wait. If the entire foundation of constructivist therapy is that reality and healing are built through human interaction, human empathy, and human dialogue.
I know where you're going with this.
What happens when the entity on the other end of the dialogue is an algorithm? Does the therapeutic alliance, the deeply human relationship that we know is the primary engine for clinical healing, does that alliance survive when the therapist is a line of code?
You are identifying the defining existential question of modern psychology. It raises profound philosophical and ethical issues about the nature of empathy.
It really does.
But if we synthesize what the data and the experts are indicating, we have to look at the massive ripple effect of these digital tools. Yes, the avatar is not a biological human with a heartbeat, but the architecture of that avatar, the underlying logic trees, the specific pacing of the dialogue, the precise wording of an exception-seeking question or the miracle question.
That entire architecture is relying on the hard-won expertise of real human clinicians.
Right. Think of it as the ultimate scaling of therapeutic technique. It's essentially human empathy and clinical technique distilled and translated into an algorithmic format.
That's a wild way to think about it.
And what we absolutely have to consider in this debate is the massive global crisis of accessibility. There are hundreds of millions of people who cannot afford a private human therapist.
There are people who live in rural areas with zero mental health infrastructure.
There are individuals who are simply too paralyzed by social anxiety to ever walk into a physical clinic and sit across from a real person. For those populations, a virtual therapist isn't replacing a human therapist. It is replacing a void.
It is replacing absolutely nothing.
Exactly.
That completely reframes the debate. It's not AI versus human, it's AI versus suffering alone.
And the most fascinating part is that research is consistently showing that human beings can and do form genuine therapeutic bonds with these programs.
Really? With an avatar?
Yes. Why? Because the client is still a human being, and the client is still doing the deeply human heavy lifting of self-reflection. The avatar is essentially just holding up a mirror. Even if it is a digital mirror, the reflection the client sees is their own humanity.
It is a wild, slightly dizzying concept to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
The idea that we can successfully outsource the delicate, not knowing curiosity of a constructivist therapist to a machine.
It sounds strange, but mechanically it makes sense.
Yeah, if you are deeply isolated, spiraling at 2.0 a.m., an AI that is programmed to ask you an exception-seeking question is vastly superior to sitting alone in the dark with a problem-saturated story.
And if we connect this back to everything we've discussed, if reality is constructed by the individual through language, and the AI provides the precise linguistic prompts that allow the individual to construct a healthier, more resilient narrative.
Then the core mechanism of healing remains perfectly intact regardless of whether the delivery method is carbon or silicon.
Precisely.
It is genuinely fascinating. But what I love most about studying the entire spectrum of these emerging trends is the realization that human psychology operates like a pendulum.
Oh,
Toward
absolutely.
every massive push in one extreme direction, there is almost always an equal and opposite counter movement. Because while half of the cutting-edge therapies are pushing us deeper into the digital matrix coding empathy into AI and putting VR headsets over our eyes, the other half of the field is actively trying to pull us offline
Or trying to get us out of the clinic entirely.
and physically back into the dirt. Let's look at the rise of ecotherapy and nature-based therapy.
This is a profound counter-movement. And as the literature explicitly defines it, this approach is doing the exact polar opposite of what most traditional Western therapies demand.
The historical Western model of therapy is highly constrained, right? It dictates that you go inside a building, you sit down in a small, usually artificially lit room, you close the heavy door, and you spend an hour looking entirely inward.
You hyper-focus on your internal emotional state and your interpsychic conflicts.
Right. And ecotherapy asserts that this relentless hyperfocus on the internal self is actually a significant part of the pathology. It forces a narrow, claustrophobic, often narcissistic view of life.
The fundamental goal of nature-based therapy is to forcefully move the person's attention outward. It is grounded in the biophilia hypothesis.
The biophilia hypothesis, what's that?
It's the idea that human beings did not evolve in sterile clinic rooms or staring at glowing rectangles. Our brains and nervous systems evolved over millions of years in constant dynamic interaction with the natural world.
The research connects this deeply to Eastern philosophical practices that have been brought to the West and secularized by figures like Thich Nhat Hanh and Jon Kabat-Zinn. This is exactly where mindfulness intersects with the therapeutic landscape.
Right, and mindfulness is often heavily commodified and misunderstood in popular culture simply as relaxation or clearing your mind. But clinical mindfulness is much more rigorous than that.
It's the active practice of intentional bodily presence.
Yes, it is about training the mind to rest from its constant, exhausting habit of time traveling. The human brain is constantly projecting into the future to worry or digging into the past to regret. Mindfulness anchors the brain in the rich, undeniable sensory data of the present moment.
And what better, more complex anchor for the human sensory system than the unpredictability of nature?
Exactly. So practically speaking, this isn't just a therapist telling you to take a nice walk in the woods while you continue to complain about your boss.
Right, it's highly intentional and structured. It might involve a guided intervention in a forest, where the therapist asks the client to focus their entire cognitive load on the sound of wind moving through the leaves, or the physical texture of tree bark.
It is about actively cultivating a sense of awe, which shrinks the ego, and fostering a deep gratitude for life's gifts. This also perfectly parallels the rise of animal-assisted therapy.
How does interacting with an animal serve the same psychological function?
Well, whether you are doing equine therapy with a horse or working with a therapy dog, the animal demands your absolute, authentic presence. A horse does not care about your past trauma.
A horse definitely does not care about your anxiety regarding a presentation next week.
An animal responds entirely and instantly to your physical, energy, and emotional state in the present moment. If you are highly anxious, the horse will be agitated. To calm the horse, you must physically regulate your own nervous system. It is immediate biological biofeedback.
Listening to this, it feels like a massive realization for the psychological community. It sounds like we are finally admitting that human beings are, in many ways, just highly complicated houseplants with complex emotions.
Wait, walk me through that. How do you mean?
Well, think about a houseplant whose leaves are turning brown and drooping. You wouldn't sit there and intensely analyze the plant's motivations.
No.
You wouldn't try to figure out if the plant has a subconscious fear of growing. You would just realize that it has been sitting in a dark, dry closet. You just need to take the plant out, put it in direct sunlight, and give it some water. You change the environment, and the organism naturally fixes itself.
That is a remarkably grounded way to synthesize it, and it highlights the profound power of this simplicity. Ecotherapy, mindfulness, and even expressive therapies like dance, movement, and art actively challenge the reductionist biomedical model we talked about at the very beginning.
The idea that healing is exclusively about fixing a broken chemical process or a faulty thought pattern locked inside the skull.
Exactly. The assumption that healing is purely an intrapsychic process. Nature-based therapies argue that healing is not just intrapsychic, it is fundamentally an ecological process. You cannot separate the psychological health of the individual from the health and context of their physical environment.
In this model, the environment itself, whether that is a sprawling forest, a deeply attuned therapy dog, or a blank canvas, becomes an active co-therapist.
It provides the physical grounding, the sensory regulation, and the connection to a larger whole that the isolated, anxious human ego so desperately needs.
It is genuinely incredible to step back and look at the vast spectrum of everything we have explored today. Because to you, the listener, this shouldn't just be an academic history lesson on the evolution of psychology. This is a massive, highly diverse toolkit that you now have conceptual access to.
It truly is a toolkit for agency. We have examined how you can absolutely take charge of your present actions using reality therapy and the WBEP system.
Right, you do not have to be a permanent victim of your past. You can ruthlessly evaluate what you are doing today and construct a new, measurable plan.
We've explored how you can fundamentally rewrite the narrative structure of your life. You can defeat externalized monsters using narrative therapy. Remember, you are not the problem is the problem.
You can choose to focus purely on the mechanics of what is already working in your life using solution-focused techniques. You can seek out cutting-edge virtual tools if human interaction is a barrier to entry.
Or, if the digital world is causing the distress, you can simply shut off your phone, step outside, and ground your nervous system in the sensory reality of the natural world.
The overarching, inescapable theme of every single one of these emerging trends is the restoration of agency. They all give the power back to the individual.
And because of that, we have a very specific challenge for you listening right now. We want you to apply one of these tools to your own life tonight.
Think of a current stressor, something that currently has you feeling stuck, anxious, or overwhelmed. I want you to ask yourself the miracle question.
Imagine you go to sleep tonight, and while you are sleeping, a miracle happens that completely solves the stressor.
You wake up tomorrow morning. What is the very first, smallest, observable sign that the miracle occurred? What is physically different about your morning routine? Find that one small, tangible thing and try to make it happen tomorrow.
It is a deeply powerful way to force your brain to shift focus from the overwhelming weight of the problem to the very first manageable step of the solution.
And as you go out and attempt that, we want to leave you with one final, lingering question to chew on. Something drawn from synthesizing everything we have discussed about where this field is heading.
We learned today from narrative and constructivist therapies that our human reality is not an absolute objective truth. It is socially constructed through our dialogues, our language, and our interactions.
But as we move rapidly toward a future of computer-assisted therapy, where virtual reality exposure replaces physical reality, and algorithms guide our healing,
we have to ask a massive defining question. When our therapeutic interactions are increasingly conducted with AI avatars and our healing environment is entirely simulated, who is actually authoring our reality?
are we simply constructing new technology to help us build better, healthier stories? Or is the technology about to start constructing us?
It is the frontier we are all standing on right now.
That is definitely something to mull over on your next walk through the woods. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Keep learning, keep questioning, and we will see you next time.